The skit you just watched is one that I put together to capture the peak of my limerent experience, or more specifically, the grief that follows limerence. And today I want to talk about this limerent grief. I don't think it is that unique of a metaphor to describe limerence as falling in love with a ghost. And I think for that reason, it is interesting that so many metaphors and symbols and stories and meanings that we make are quite similar, quite universal. And that's the same with grief. This video is dedicated for those of you who are in the eye of a storm, and to my clients who have been so vulnerable in sharing their stories and their journey. Now, this particular discussion was hard for me to step into because I find that I am on the other side of grief. I had to go backwards and sit in that state. And the way I did that was poring over old journal entries that I've written, and by sharing that story, that little skit I made. This relates to something that I find very curious, which is how grief and memory are tied together. And I'll go more into detail. But I want to first talk about the very basics of grief. When people hear that word, they might think of death. But grief is more than that. Grief is a loss of identity. It is the realization of impermanence, even the re-emergence of the wound of past attachments. Limerence brings all of this up. And oh my gosh, this is gonna sound abstract, so hopefully you're following. It's peculiar to think of what came first, the limerence or the grief. I find that when you are vulnerable to limerence is when you are in this transitory state of grief, where things are changing in your life. At least it was for me, where there is ambivalence about what direction to go in. So it's hard to say if the limerence brings you back to that grief that has already been there, or if that grief comes after the limerence or the loss of that limerent object. That being said, the limerence tends to bring up all these feelings of realizing the impermanence in an emotion, in a state of highs and lows, that sense of pleasure, and what's left is that void. What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't only seem to arise if you have complex PTSD or past attachment wounds. But when you are facing some kind of loss, whether that's a relationship ending, a life transition, or a shift in who you thought you were, in some ways, it might seem as though limerence functions as a drive towards what is an internal shift. And that could very well be one that forces you to face that grief, that loss, to return to that pain. And then it seems it is up to you to learn how to release it. What always struck me too is how similar it can feel, limerence and grief. The first, the physiological response. Dorothy Tenoff, the woman who coined the term limerence, described this physical ache which radiates throughout your whole body. It's that melancholy. It's that pressure in the chest, that floating feeling. It's a well of longing. Grief feels the same way. It's like you're suspended in yearning, and your nervous system is so caught in this loop. But instead of yearning for someone that is gone, you're yearning for someone who never truly was yours. That in itself is a very painful and complicated thing to talk about. It can be very isolating in that way. Two things that this kind of grief reminds me of, which is the disenfranchised type of grief and the ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is the kind of grief that someone experiences when there is no direct closure. Whether that is because somebody is still alive and you're grieving them, or in limerence, that person never actually fully existed. You've fallen in love with a ghost. And then disenfranchised grief, which is a term where it's harder for some people to validate unless they've experienced it, because some people don't think these kinds of griefs count. You were never with that person, not really, but it doesn't mean that the pain of the loss isn't there. And in that space, it is so isolating. Like I said in the skit, it's all of which is filled up by the limerent object. But staying there is what perpetuates the haunting. It's what prolongs that sadness. The second thing is the similarities between grief and limerence when it comes to the preservation of memory. When my dog passed away in 2022, I remember having to write every detail of the day that he passed away. Like many of you all who only write in their journal when you're compelled to, when you have strong emotions. And I found that when I'm grieving, I need to remember everything. And it's not like I'm gonna ever go back there and read about that day. But for some reason, when we're experiencing that kind of loss, there's this need to put it down. Same with limerence. There's this compulsion to write every detail down about this ghost, this limerent object, to remember it, to remember them, to remember how they made you feel, and to try and preserve the meaning. And I'm always cautious of trying not to romanticize the experience of limerence or even grief. It's not romantic. Sometimes it's filled with rage and regret and embarrassment. There is something about finding some sort of meaning that gives us closure. It seems that this journal that I have is broken down in two parts. One is all the ambivalence and transitions and grief that I was facing in my life before I met them. And then in the second part was all the fantasies I deluded myself in to, in some subconscious way, distract myself of that ambivalence. In my very last entry, I wrote, because that was what limerence taught me, how to grieve and how to let go. And I realized from then, took me a while, that it wasn't just obsession that I was experiencing, but rather grief, that looping. We have to make it mean something, that it couldn't have been all in vain. If you're watching this and you're feeling haunted and you find yourself still in love with a ghost, I want to share with you that you are not alone. Let limerence be your teacher. If this resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe. Tell me, what has limerence meant to you? Until next time, I wish you all the very best. Fallen in love with a ghost, and I'm afraid I can't let it go this time. Who are these ghosts? Honestly, I'm not sure. They feel strangely familiar, like someone I've met before. Sounds like there's something comforting about that. Why would you want to let them go? Well, that's the problem. Once they leave in the morning, I'm left with this void that makes me feel more disconnected from people in my real life. But what if that's why they appeared in the first place? It's like they fill all the empty spaces. When I think about it, I trust them more than people I can actually reach out and hold, because ghosts can't hurt me the way real people can. This fits my theory that these aren't ghosts, but rather the fragments of your memories and fictions that you carry inside of your head to protect you from your lonely existence, and protects you from the possibility that everyone you love will somehow disappoint you, reject you, or leave you. How is this supposed to help me? Just reality, or rather the risk that we take when falling in love with real people.